Markets celebrate freedom loudly, yet every empire secretly builds a safety net beneath the trading floor always. London learned early that confidence collapses faster than profits, so someone must promise rescue when panic arrives. This promise became architecture, embedded in clearinghouses, central banks, and private agreements hidden behind respectable language everywhere. They called it discipline, prudence, liquidity management, but in truth, it was the backstop empire awakening quietly. In good times, the system pretends independence, celebrating risk-taking heroes and efficient markets rewarded through competition alone. But London keeps spare oxygen ready, because when trust evaporates, ideology becomes luxury few banks afford then. Central banks hold emergency tools, like swap lines, discount windows, collateral programs, and lender of last resort authority for stability. These mechanisms appear technical, yet they decide which institutions survive history and which dissolve into footnotes entirely. Britain discovered backstopping power during 19th century crises when panics threatened commerce, stretching across the empire itself. The Bank of England intervened reluctantly, lending against good collateral, restoring calm while warning speculators about consequences. That reluctance became myth, suggesting rescues were temporary exceptions rather than permanent foundations supporting global finance everywhere. But each crisis strengthened expectations until silence itself implied London would intervene whenever confidence reached breaking point. Backstops create moral hazard because players take bolder risks, knowing safety nets remain stretched beneath them always. Regulators respond with stress tests, capital buffers, living wills, and painstaking supervision designed to offset temptation somehow. Still, every participant secretly believes extraordinary support will appear again if collapse threatens the entire system tomorrow. This belief is currency itself, traded daily through tone, reputation, and London's history of keeping promises alive. During the Great Depression and later wars, backstops preserved industrial capacity when ordinary financing froze completely worldwide. Post-war reconstruction deepened dependence, as governments and banks recognized intervention prevented social collapse alongside economic ruin repeatedly. London's expertise positioned it as coordinator, balancing prudence with necessary risk so commerce could continue expanding safely. Thus the backstop empire matured quietly, rarely celebrated, always essential whenever the world demanded financial oxygen again. In modern markets, backstops appear through swap lines connecting central banks, like arteries sharing liquidity across continents. During turmoil, dollars flow through London overnight, stabilizing institutions that otherwise might fail before morning arrives again. Clearinghouses contribute similar protection, demanding collateral when prices fall so losses cannot cascade unchecked through networks everywhere. Behind every screen of flashing numbers stands an invisible lattice, preventing panic from becoming systemic failure instantly. Yet power invites scrutiny, and critics ask who decides which firms deserve rescue when chaos arrives anywhere. Officials insist criteria are neutral, based on collateral, solvency, and systemic relevance, rather than personal influence alone. But markets understand relationships matter, and London's credibility depends on appearing fair while protecting essential stability carefully. This delicate balance defines the backstop empire, simultaneously referee, participant, guardian, and reluctant savior of capitalism itself. Technology accelerates both opportunity and panic, forcing backstops to evolve faster than legislation or institutional memory alone. Algorithms trade in microseconds, yet confidence still travels at human speed, requiring judgment beyond models and code. So London blends mathematics with experience, weighing intervention timing like a conductor maintaining rhythm during difficult passages. The goal remains unchanged: prevent temporary fear from crystallizing into permanent destruction across households, companies, and nations. Backstops extend beyond finance into energy, pensions, trade credit, and housing, wherever collapse risks social stability significantly. Governments design guarantees, and insurance schemes, while insisting markets remain free, preserving narrative alongside protective reality carefully. Citizens rarely notice until danger arrives, then demand intervention instantly, proving safety nets became cultural expectation worldwide. And through every episode, London advises, coordinates, and manages fallout with understated professionalism and deep institutional memory. Still, dependence carries risk, because if backstops ever fail, repercussions would dwarf previous crises, remembered by history. Hence capital buffers grow, recovery plans expand, and supervision intensifies, reinforcing the foundations quietly year after year. Trust remains London's strongest asset, a reservoir replenished through consistency, transparency, and timely responses during emergencies worldwide. Investors accept lower returns in exchange for certainty, recognizing stability ultimately determines survival in ruthless markets everywhere. The backstop empire lacks flags, borders, or anthems. Its authority shapes behavior from Shanghai to Sao Paulo. Britain's legacy endures not through conquest, but through predictable rescue when catastrophe threatens global commerce severely today. As long as the world values certainty, London will remain guardian of last resorts for markets everywhere. And somewhere behind the fog, policymakers rehearse disaster again, preparing the net they hope never gets used. Because true power today is not in making rules, but in preventing collapse when rules eventually fail. That is the backstop empire. Invisible until the moment everyone needs it desperately to continue breathing financially. And London, patient and prepared, still holds the blueprint, rehearsed through centuries of crisis and recovery carefully. Whether celebrated or criticized, the safety net remains, stretched quietly beneath the theater of global finance forever. But every safety net creates shadows, places where risk hides comfortably behind expectations of eventual rescue appearing. Speculators whisper confidently, believing London and central banks will intervene whenever losses threaten systemic collapse again worldwide. Regulators warn repeatedly about moral hazard, yet they also recognize panic destroys faster than rules can possibly repair. So the backstop empire lives between contradiction and necessity, criticized loudly yet summoned urgently whenever fear spreads uncontrollably. Corporate treasurers and sovereign borrowers design strategies assuming liquidity backstops will always reopen credit channels during crisis. This assumption stabilizes planning, allowing ambitious investment while quietly hardwiring dependency into the bloodstream of global finance today. Politicians praise market discipline during prosperity, then demand extraordinary intervention when voters face unemployment, foreclosure, or shattered pensions. Thus, the backstop empire becomes political shield, absorbing blame while silently preserving foundations governments cannot risk losing entirely. Central banks rehearse emergency programs, like orchestras preparing difficult symphonies they hope never perform before live audiences. Currencies swap through coordinated lines, collateral frameworks expand, and disclosure rules adapt to preserve fragile confidence across continents. London coordinates quietly, lending expertise, precedent, and language refined through centuries of crisis management and cautious experimentation combined. Power emerges not from ownership, but from the ability to stabilize when everything else threatens to fracture. Clearinghouses sit at the center, demanding margin during volatility, preventing cascading defaults from swallowing counterparties whole overnight. Their role appears technical, yet they determine survival odds, deciding which trades remain sustainable during violent market shocks. London's clearing architecture underpins derivatives, bonds, equities, commodities, and foreign exchange, the essential circulatory system of capitalism. If clearing stops, everything stops, which is why backstops exist precisely where collapse would otherwise begin. Critics ask difficult questions about fairness, wondering why some institutions qualify as systemically important while others simply disappear. Officials answer with cautious language about contagion risk, interconnected exposures, and broader economic stability wiring selective intervention tactically. Still, suspicion lingers, because power never feels neutral, especially when exercised inside closed rooms during existential financial emergencies. London must therefore defend legitimacy constantly, proving discipline other than favoritism guides every rescue decision made carefully. Technology transforms risk faster than law adapts, creating unfamiliar vulnerabilities inside payment systems, digital exchanges, and algorithmic trading networks. Cyber attacks threaten confidence as deeply as insolvency, forcing backstops to include resilience planning beyond traditional liquidity assistance now. The backstop empire stretches further into cybersecurity, operational continuity, and data infrastructure shaping the future of financial survival. Once again, London stands central, merging tradition with innovation while rehearsing responses to crises that have not arrived. Green finance introduces another dimension, as climate risk challenges long-standing assumptions about collateral security and asset valuation everywhere. Insurance, banking, and pensions depend on stability that extreme weather increasingly undermines across multiple regions simultaneously worldwide. Backstops evolve accordingly, preparing to manage shocks that resemble slow earthquakes rather than sudden explosions within capital markets. This responsibility expands London's influence, positioning it as guardian of transition as well as guardian of liquidity. Behind closed doors, policymakers wrestle with an ancient dilemma: how to protect society without encouraging reckless behavior in markets. They publish frameworks, consultation papers, and stress results, yet the core judgment remains human, intuitive, experience-driven, and time-sensitive. Backstops require courage, because intervention always attracts criticism from those who forget collapse would have hurt much worse. London carries these scars quietly, convinced stability is a higher duty than ideological purity or performative political declarations anywhere. Investors understand this truth instinctively, pricing assets according to confidence that authorities will prevent catastrophic failure under pressure. When that confidence strengthens, capital flows more freely toward innovation, infrastructure, and long-term growth, benefiting millions of ordinary households. Thus, the backstop empire indirectly finances progress. Even while remaining suspicious of speculative excess, it sometimes unintentionally encourages. Its influence is paradoxical, preserving capitalism by softening its sharpest crises, while refusing to remove discipline entirely. Emerging markets rely on swap lines and coordinated action to avoid currency collapse when global tensions escalate unexpectedly. London often intermediates, providing legal certainty and market depth essential for sovereign borrowers navigating turbulent international conditions safely. This role grants quiet diplomatic power, enabling Britain to stabilize allies without speeches, armies, or overt geopolitical confrontation. The backstop empire becomes instrument of statecraft, conducted through spreadsheets, covenants, and liquidity windows rather than battalions. Financial history suggests every system eventually faces stress greater than designers once imagined when building original safeguards. London therefore treats complacency as enemy, constantly reinforcing institutional capacity while recording lessons from every past emergency carefully. Resilience becomes craft, blending humility with readiness, acknowledging control is never total yet that must appear reliable enough. The backstop empire lives within this humility, aware that confidence rests on competence proven repeatedly under extraordinary pressure. Some dream of pure free markets without rescue, but experience shows democracies rarely accept suffering required to maintain them. Voters demand protection when livelihoods shatter, and leaders respond with intervention that inevitably strengthens backstop expectations further. Thus idealism surrenders to realism, and realism eventually consults London, because London understands the choreography of containment. Power persists not through dominance, but through indispensable service that no competing centre yet provides at equivalent scale. So the Backstop empire endures, quieter than law, older than digital finance, and more human than algorithmic certainty. It exists wherever policymakers decide collapse is unacceptable, and where societies value continuity above ideological rigidity during turmoil. Britain no longer rules oceans, but it still anchors storms blowing through global markets with measured reassurance. And London waits, watchful and prepared, knowing the next test will arrive suddenly, as it always has before. If this story changed how you see safety nets quietly supporting capitalism beneath London's disciplined shadow today, remember, freedom only survives because someone promises rescue when the music stops and panic begins consuming confidence. Subscribe for more untold histories where finance, psychology, and hidden power intertwine beneath the smooth surface of global stability. Because the next rescue already exists in draft form, waiting silently for the moment fear finally returns.